Wes, jackass. So
describe your heart palpitations as
yeah,
you were like looking at, like, I can't imagine what it must be like for this whole thing.
this is actually really uncomfortable. I did not write a book with the intention of this being the result, so that's a little weird. I guess I did pick a section that I want to read, and I will read it. I don't want to take up too much of everybody's time because I know it's been a long day for everybody, and we've got tomorrow too. But the artwork that Sarah did is really amazing, and I have these up here. I also have some of them for sale if you want to, and the money goes to Sarah because it should. And you can also just come up and pick them up. I brought these to, last week I actually got to go to Falmouth High School. My father teaches there, and I get to go to Lewiston High School because I have a former grad school classmate who teaches there, and talk to kids about writing and share their artwork and talk about the book. And it was really cool. It was actually by far the coolest thing I've gotten to do because I like talking to students, because the reason I wrote this is because of my freshman English teacher at NYA when I was there. So I do want to mention, because he's not here and Wes was here in spirit and electronically, the map that's over there on the stand, and then the other one that is beyond that, that's in the frame. The one in the frame I hand drew with my meager drawing skills. And then the one that's in the frame is the eastern continent of that map. That's the whole world map in the frame, and the eastern continent isn't what's in the book because that's the only part of the world that the story takes place in the first book. That map was done by my friend Shane Thurston, and he went to college with me at Wheaton, graduated in 2009, a year after I did, 2010, 2 years after I did. And he not only did that digital map, he set up the website, he formatted the book for Kindle and print, he designed a font, created his own font for the text in the book, and also made this really cool, if you get a physical copy of the paperback, and I think you can see on the Kindle, it has like a marbled style to the actual cover, so it looks like stone. He did that. Along with doing just a ton of other things on the side, doing formatting. Wes did the majority of the editing, but he also did some formatting. And so Shane, he lives out in California and obviously would not be able to be here, but I told him I would mention him because he deserved it. And he continues to help me with a lot of stuff. We're actually working on some things for next weekend right now. So.
Did your friend Shane design the Legacy Chronicle font, or where did you pull
Yes.
that from?
Yeah,
that's a really nice font.
Yeah, he came up with all that stuff. He basically took it and started with a white font, and then gradually made it look like stone, so it would kind of fade into that background a little better. And I mean, it came out he got me something that's really original. And for those of you who don't know, because I self-published it, you can basically go through CreateSpace and Amazon, and they will do these things for you, or you can just kind of give them a generic cover or whatever and put that out there like a black and white, black font on white background. And Shane and I was really adamant to him that I wanted this to be a real book, that this wasn't just me doing what I've told students, a vanity publishing. Like, you publish it so you can have people over for dinner party and be like, oh, by the way, I wrote a book, here it is on my shelf. No one's ever read it. And like that, I didn't want that. Like, I actually wrote this with the intention of people reading it, and that was the only reason I really did it. Everything that has happened since has been kind of a whirlwind, overwhelming bonus, because about 1,000 copies have been sold at this point, and that's actually really mind-blowing, and I have a really hard time dealing with that. So you can ask Molly, she knows.
I'd like to buy 1001.
Absolutely. Although I think Emily Darby may beat you to the punch. So, yeah, I wrote it for Ross Marconnor. Some of you know that I went to NYA and gave him a copy at their last school meeting of the year a couple weeks ago, and that was really awesome. But I was excited to hit the 600 book mark because my professor at Wheaton, Michael Drought, when I went to tell him, that I was doing this in very Drought fashion, just says, well, you got to sell 600, and then just kind of walked away. And I was like, well, hold on, like, where do you get this arbitrary number? And he said, oh, well, statistically, and he's an English teacher, but he's a maniac, so he has all these, he knows all these weird facts. He said, if you sell 600 books, it will be someone's favorite book, and they will contact you. Like, that's the magic number for somebody to, fall in love with something that you did. And I said, okay, well, then we'll make that the goal. So I got the email the other day, said, we hit 600, and he just wrote back and said, it'll be 601, much like you, Grace, because I still haven't bought it yet. So, but yeah, I guess guess I just wanted to say I wrote this because I needed to do it. I had the story in my head for a really, really long time, and I am, despite how I sometimes feel like I act professionally and publicly, I'm actually a very internal person. I know I talk a lot. That's me. It's happening right now. But I spend a lot more time in here, and a lot of that time is in a world that doesn't exist, which is pretty weird. But it was something that helped me develop as a person and get through life. And the way I think about a lot of things is kind of internalized in stuff that I wrote down, and I'm going to keep writing down. So it was really a relief to finish it, and then has since become like this overwhelming challenge, because now it's going to conventions and book signings and talking to students and doing all these things that I did not think was part of this. Figure like you write it and you just go, okay, done, and like move on, and that's not actually like what happened. So I don't really know what it's going to be like as I try to write the next one, because as I've been saying to Molly, I kind of just want to sit down and write, and I can't do that yet. I have all these other things that have to get done first. So anyway, I'll stop talking and start reading. That's the same thing. So I read a section at the Academic Expo. I'm going to read a slightly shorter section than that today. The part I read at the Expo was sort of very early in the book, when Trem, who's the main character, is talking to Garrett Oakart, who's the soul tree that Sarah drew. And the concept of the book, elves die and are buried, and where they're buried, trees grow, and that tree kind of contains their spirit, and the more powerful or like beloved you are, the greater the tree. So his tree's enormous, and that's a kind of pivotal moment in Trem trying to make this decision. Do I leave with this young man that I've rescued, Joven, and take him to find his father, or do I stay and keep myself hidden away from the world? So what I'm going to read is he has chosen to take Joven on this journey to find his father, of course, because otherwise the story ends in chapter 2, and it's not very interesting. And they're headed to a town called Gailakill, which is this meeting place for all these travelers. So, and if you own the book and haven't read to this point, don't worry, it's not going to spoil anything, I think. Trem and Joven reached Gailakill shortly before nightfall, after 4 full days of travel across the plains. The brisk pace set by Trem had continued unabated, despite his recognition that Javanaleth was struggling to keep up. In Trem's mind, time was of the essence, and his companion did not complain or ask him to slow his progress, so Trem did not. Nor would Trem check on him. He merely kept them both fed and made sure they were able to camp and sheltered in relatively safe areas during their journey. Trem allowed no fires during the long march, and he was rewarded by the two having no encounters with anyone, traveler or bandit, on the worn and fading road. There was a distinct mood to the town as soon as they reached the outskirts. The sprawl of desperate people outside the walls was visible from afar, and when they were still some distance off, Joven remarked that it looked like there were ants crawling about the base of the city walls. Trem made no response, instead keeping his mind focused singularly on their purpose for coming here. As they came close enough to distinguish the individual people all around the palisade, he glued his eyes to the gates, trying to avoid any acknowledgement of the desperate situation all about him. Javanaleth was quite the opposite. He took in the ragged crowds of hopeless and exhausted faces, scanning the entirety of their number as they approached and made their way to the main gate. It was clear many of the refugees were without food, or at least had very small amounts of it, but they made no attempt to beg or plead coins or supplies from the true travelers. Their walk up the road was unimpeded. In fact, many stepped aside to allow them through. To Joven, it was clear this was a great mass of defeated people, not those who had fight left in them and were going to seek aid from passerby. He also noted among the worn frames of makeshift tents and camps bloody rags and grievous wounds. War had come to the dust plains, and these people were merely its harbinger. Trem and Joven reached the gate, looming high and sturdy before them. 4 guards stood outside the entrance they came upon, thoroughly eyeing them both, but not asking any questions. Above them, Trem could see several archers keeping a sharp eye on the newcomers. Those outside gripped their pikes and watched them tensely, clearly aware of their responsibility but uncomfortable with it at the same time. Trem slowed his approach, and they halted a safe distance from the guards. They pushed one of their number forward, and he attempted to assume an air of authority. "What business do you have in Gailakill?" We're seeking the whereabouts of a man we believe passed through here, Trem answered. Do you have coin? We can take no more within our walls who cannot pay. Some. Trem pulled a small pouch from his belt and held it up so the guards could see. Enough for a room for a night or two. This seemed to satisfy the guards, and they motioned for the gates to be opened. Jovan had expected questions about their weaponry, for the two were heavily armed for simple travelers. But in truth, the presence of more fighting men and women in the city was looked on as favorable by most. Violence in the streets was clearly not a concern. What lurked beyond the walls was the real source of fear. The great doors of the palisade swung open, and the two walked in, the town of Guylick stretching out before them. The guards watched until the pair turned a corner off of the main road, trying to find a street not packed tight with the bodies of refugees in their meager shelters. The town itself was a cluster of thatched roofs supported by solid wooden or mud brick houses. These uniform structures dominated the majority of the town, but a slightly larger building with a smoke hole in the hut top and the rhythmic clanging of hammers clearly stood out as the blacksmith, some distance in the east, if Trem had to make a guess. The eeriness of the sounds in the street was unnerving. Children from the town were not darting around playing at being heroes or engaged in games of tag. In fact, the few that were out were under careful eyes of concerned mothers who would not let them stray too far due to the other occupants of the road. Being about dusk, the streets were still relatively full of the most run-down people Trem had ever seen. Most of them were humans and halflings, smaller and stockier humanoids who were fond of farming in the countryside. But all these people, regardless of race, appeared to be those who had retreated from destroyed villages to the east to find someplace safer than where they came from. A few true elves dotted the street sides too, but they were heavily outnumbered by the others sitting forlornly beside them. Those elves that were there looked to be dead already, sunken eyes and distressed faces, their halfling and human counterparts not much better off. Trem expected at least some of them to beg for coins or other help, but like their fellow refugees beyond the walls, they just sat as though defeated. Perhaps, he admitted, they already were. The crowd continued to stare beyond he and Jovan as they passed by. Travelers clearly no longer brought much notice, even unique ones. Their beaten appearance kept Trem focused on the hundreds of refugees, despite all his efforts to ignore the dire situation. Trem could not make his eyes turn away, but Jovan tugged at his sleeve, pulling him out of his thoughts. There's the inn. I bet that's the best place to find rumor of a traveler. Trem nodded, murmuring, there are lots of travelers, only it seems many have nowhere to go. Jovan looked at Trem sadly. Clearly the scene on the street disturbed Javanaleth as well, but he knew there was nothing to be done. Trem watched a woman come out of the inn and hand loaves of bread to the people on the street. There wasn't enough for even a quarter of the people there, and a few scattered fights broke out. He spotted two children, little over 7 years, flailing and striking at each other to steal just a scrap more of food. Leaving Jovan's side, he walked to them and took the piece of bread they were fighting over, holding it away above their heads, while they watched angrily, knowing they could do nothing. Trem smiled as disarmingly as he could manage. This is not worth fighting over. If I split it between you, then you will both have something to eat. You can take this too. He pulled some dried meat from his pack and gave one piece to each. The boys stared wide-eyed at meat they probably had not tasted for months, and then, as though they feared he might rethink his generosity, they ran swiftly away from him. Trem watched them for a while and shook his head to clear his thoughts. He felt rather foolish for his charity at that moment. Trying to shake off his conflicting emotions, he walked over to Javanaleth. His companion patted him on the shoulder, remarking, "For a loner, you seem to get along with people well." It was a foolish decision. We will need those supplies as well. Jovan was somewhat taken aback by Trem's hard tone. Starving children can have my share any day. I would not call your actions foolish. Trem did not reply, still a bit out of sorts, and followed into the inn door. The building was large and rambling with 3 above-ground levels. The base of it was clearly the common room. Trem could hear a minstrel singing the grand ballad of Bullwife Margrave and the War of the Lion. He paused before entering the main room, and Jovan looked back questioningly. Trem swallowed and said, "Go get us a table and a room. I need to take a walk." Jovan seemed to hesitate, and Trem tried to reassure him. "Don't worry, I will not be long." Jovan decided even should he want to, he could not convince Trem to come in now. Besides, he thought, there was little trouble Trem could get into that he could not get out of in this place. The hermit, despite his youth and inexperience, had a deadly walk, one that appeared trained into him and something he would never shake off. Jovan nodded and said, "All right, but don't be long. Some of these people are more desperate than they look, and do not get lost." Trem solemnly turned and started off down the main road at a brisk pace, away from the larger crowds of refugees. Javanaleth hesitated, wondering if he ought to follow, and chose against it. Trem wanted to be alone, and Jovan decided he should respect that. Thinking that this was probably the best thing he could do, Javanaleth entered the inn and was immediately swallowed up in the noise and rush of dim light.